Hi there.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome.
I'm Charles.
Hey, Charles. I'm Chloe.
Good. Are we early or we're just
Just perfectly on time. I mean, here it says 1:59. We have 1 minute. Natalie is going to join us in a moment and we'll jump in.
all right?
Yeah. And we're actually the person that we're doing the coaching with is not quite on yet. So we'll just hang out and wait for her.
All right.
Yeah. Hi there.
Hello.
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 I'm actually going to get a cup of water. I'll be right back.
Is that light bothering us in the back?
The light behind you?
Yes. It's
Uh,
okay.
It's okay for me. Yeah.
I'm not an expert zoomer.
Even after 2 years of COVID.
Well, actually, my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all Zoom, and I just provide the electricity.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. Hi. We'll get started in a few minutes when Kat joins us. She's the person who we're going to be kind of taking a deep dive on her garden with, and
All right.
glad to have the rest of you here too. Yeah. Oh, I'm blurry. Oh, we can't do the blurry. It'll just be one of us. I'm going to change that. It's a little
Oh, a
funny.
bunch of people are coming.
Hi.
Good,
Hi.
good afternoon. It's afternoon, isn't it? All right.
Let's see. How do I change that? Background filters. That's what it is. None. Okay, there we go. Hi, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. All right.
Hello.
So Kat, I see you're here. Hello. So
Hi.
if everybody who is not Kat could please mute yourself. Oh, sorry. I turned our video off to adjust. There we go. Whoops. That would be really helpful so we can hear each other without a lot of background noise. And then, yeah, so just to introduce, so we're going to be doing a garden coaching session with Kat, and she shared some information with us earlier, and what is a student in one of our online classes, Garden Planning 101, and there was a little raffle that we did, or a lottery, I guess, for a one-on-one coaching call. And so we're going to be talking with Kat, and I'm really glad that the rest of you are here to be listening and to be hopefully learning from our conversation with her. And we're not going to have a big Q&A with everybody right now, but we do live Q&As monthly with the Online Gardening School, which is a program that Natalie and I created that is like super comprehensive online gardening education, all aspects of organic and sustainable kind of permaculture inspired gardening. So if that's something you're interested in, please check it out. But for now, today, we're going to be dialoguing with Kat, and y'all are welcome to listen in and soak it up.
And we're writing a book.
Yeah, we're writing a book too.
So it's
Forthcoming
gardening
in a
gardening book.
couple of years, probably. All right. So everybody's mute. So Kat, you can unmute yourself. And hi.
Hello. How are y'all?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Yeah.
How are you? Oh, we already asked you. Cool. So we know a little bit about your garden, but because this is like a, not just for your education, but also for the education of everyone who's watching, we're just going to kind of go over some of those things before we get into more detail. So, Kat, where do you live?
I live in Fairview, so about 20 minutes outside of Asheville.
Okay, so in North Carolina in the mountains.
Mhm.
And your last frost date is probably like May 8th or May 15th, something like that.
I think it might be a smidge earlier just because of like the microclimate we're in.
Totally.
We're hoping for like mid to late April, but we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
I
a
don't
little
think so.
crazy, right?
Yeah.
The climate changes to know when weather is going to happen.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think last year, all over the region, I think May 15th was the last frost. So
Yeah.
I hear you're eager, hoping.
We'll see.
I would not set out your tomatoes in the middle of April. So, and you have gardened 1 year before, is that correct?
We moved to this house where there's a garden patch out back that's sort of shared between neighbors, but my partner Will and I are mainly the ones using it. And we moved here last summer, so we really didn't get even like a full season out of it. But you know, around like June, July, I started putting some stuff in the ground.
Sweet. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And what kind of state is the garden in right now? Is it like, is it in cover crop or covered in leaves or just kind of hanging out, or?
There's a little bit of cover crop coming up, but not, we maybe planted it a little bit late. So it's, some of the beds are mostly uncovered. We've got one row where we planted some garlic and shallots, and then have like sort of remnants of a very small herb spiral that we had done. Other than that, it's kind of like ready to be, you know, weeded a bit and planted.
Cool.
Great.
Nice.
So just from what you shared with us in the form that you filled out, your main, just correct me or add to this, but your main goals are like, so you're renting, so you want to like get the most out of this garden and really dig in and grow a lot and learn a lot, but without investing a ton of money, especially, and a ton of infrastructure, because you're renting. So, you know, there's that lack of predictability and stability. And also timing seems like a big question that you have. And then sort of how to get the most out of, how to really get three harvests, 3 seasons here in this region, where it gets cold in the winter. So we don't have like a year-round growing season, but we can kind of stretch it out. Are those the main things that you're wanting to talk about? Are there other things? And we can kind of just, you know, be organic about it too.
Yeah, that's mostly it. You know, we don't want to do anything like too much perennial, just because we don't know if we'll be here again in years future. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, just, and also wanting to make sure that we don't like bite off more than we could chew with how much we're trying to plant.
Smart.
Yeah, good thinking.
Good thinking. And that begs another question, like how many hours a week do you want to dedicate to gardening?
I would say probably, you know, we could spend, because we're both working, so like an hour on the weekdays, and then like on the weekends when we really can jump in there and do like a half day on Saturday, Sunday. So a little bit along the week, and then can do some of those bigger projects on the weekends.
Yeah, that's really smart. And I think it's really wise for you to, you know, be thinking about, we don't want to bite off more than we can chew, because it's so easy. And we've seen people do this a lot, where they'll plant this giant garden in the spring, because it's really easy to just like, you know, especially if the ground is like relatively easy to move into, it's relatively prepared to just like plant so much. But then when it comes to maintaining it over time and harvesting it and using the harvest, and it can be kind of like not this exciting thing, but this like disappointing thing, and especially being like disappointed in yourself, which is really not what we want.
No.
With gardening. So I just think it's really beautiful and wise, and want to really emphasize that for everybody who's on this call, your wisdom, Kat, with wanting to be cautious with how much you bite off.
Yeah. That kind of makes me think of another question, which is like, it's sort of a 2-part question. Like, what are the kinds of things that you're super excited, like, you know, like, oh, I want to grow these, or just everything, or other particular things? And also in terms of like the time and passion you have for cooking and like food preservation. You know, we had a student who grew a big garden one year, and he grew, I don't know, like what I would consider a reasonable, you know, medium-sized patch of green beans. And it was way too much for him because he wasn't preserving them. And green beans just come on super, like, there, you can have way too many really easily. Mm-hmm. So yeah, what is your relationship with cooking and eating vegetables and preserving the harvest?
I really love to cook. I don't have a ton of experience with preserving, but do want to try. We're planning to do a good bit of cabbages, especially at the beginning of the season, and trying to make some krauts and kimchis, more of that. I think that even if we do end up with a bumper crop of something, if we can't eat it ourselves, we have plenty of people we can gift food to, and we have our neighbors who want to have some input, but have young families, so they're like, we can't really commit to the kind of weekly work that Will and I can. So that's why I want to have a decent variety, just so we have a lot of different things to cook throughout the year. But then we also do want to plant some herbs would be great, because so we can always pick something fresh out of the garden. And then we'll do some flowers as well. So we have some cut flowers and some edible flowers too.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah.
And Kat, do you mind mentioning for us, cabbage seems to be a really big one that you would like to do a bunch of. What are your top 8 vegetables that you would like to grow that fit well into your diet?
Mm-hmm.
Also that some things like tomatoes, they're kind of prissy and take up some time. The plants themselves can just have a lot of needs, but there's nothing like a homegrown tomato, this sort of thing. So what are, and you don't even need to censor yourself as far as thinking of things that are challenging or whatever, but what are vegetables that you would really have interest in growing? And then we can kind of go through when you would plant them, and whether that's something that takes a lot of work or isn't that much work
in this region.
Particular region. Because if we were talking to you and you were in Washington State or you were in Utah, we would have different advice for which vegetables to grow.
Yeah.
And luckily we've been around the block with our gardening ventures.
So top 8 that you want a significant amount of.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I would say cabbages for sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I really like alliums, so maybe bunching onions is something nice to have kind of throughout the season a bit. Beets or rutabaga, some sort of a nice root veg, or carrots maybe. I like having those on hand. Definitely lettuce greens, a variety of fresh greens we can eat. I mean, tomatoes and peppers, I do like to have those on hand. And then how many is that? 6-ish?
You can do 10, I think.
Yeah.
This is 7.
One that this might kind of count with greens, but we did grow some Malabar spinach last season and just loved how that continued to just grow and grow and grow.
Yeah.
You could always have some spinach on hand. And then beans,
Green
drying beans.
Oh, drying beans for cooking.
Yes.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
And then butternut squash is a favorite as well.
Great.
Awesome. And then herbs.
And
For sure.
herbs. So zucchinis are not a huge need for you. Okay, cool.
Cucumbers, not so much.
We'll probably throw some cucumbers in the mix, but yeah, summer squash is not our
Okay.
go-to.
That's great.
Cool.
Well, I really like how you are just there's no need to grow everything. I think that's something that,
Yeah.
we get so ambitious and how you're summer squash, I don't really care about it. That's just, and some other person, summer squash is going to be the one thing they want to grow. And dry beans, I'm really excited about dry beans. Whereas other people are they cost $3 a pound at the store. I don't need to grow them. So I just really like your discernment as you're talking about that. So that's really cool. So I think that it could be cool to just kind of talk about space and time with this list of vegetables. Does that feel like a cool way to go about
Space and time and timing.
And timing.
Yeah. Because some of them
Yeah.
are summer crops. Some of
Yeah.
them could be spring and fall. Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
So should we go through each vegetable or would you rather go through the year?
maybe let's go through each vegetable and you can write some notes or you can take notes too. And then we can kind of loop back and do like, so now
Yeah.
this is what would happen. And then in a few months and then, in the summer.
Yeah. And just so everyone knows, all this information that we're going to be talking about is in the online gardening school is like, we think from our research, the best online resource for gardening online. So I really encourage everyone to check it out. And in the online gardening school, each month has a video about each vegetable. So you can watch like just the vegetables that you are growing. Like you can watch the video for April and the video for May. And blah,
Yeah.
blah.
And it can be helpful. I mean, we'll talk you through this, but because they're videos, it can be helpful to see like what you were saying, Kat, about the time, like, okay, this is something that is going to need daily picking or daily care at some point. And this is what that actually looks like for one plant, like how many plants, just to get like an actual visual feel for that can be helpful, but we'll talk you through it now too.
And something that I want to preface with before we take a deep dive, that you may already totally know this, Kat, but just for everybody who's on the call, is that your last frost date has to do with when you can put plants in the ground that are frost sensitive. So like tomatoes, if they experience temperatures below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, for a sustained period of time, they will die. And so there's some plants, like some varieties of lettuce and some varieties of various brassicas, like broccoli and kale and stuff like that, that can withstand freezing temperatures. So just because we say, oh, you might not want to put stuff in until May 15th, we're only talking about frost sensitive items. Like that doesn't go for everything.
Yeah. So
that said, we're going to just address each of your vegetables as we go. And it sounds like you have about 500 square feet to work with.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty good sized garden, for a beginner. You may choose to use the whole thing, you may not. And something that we also, go into in the garden planning guide is, I think a lot of beginning gardeners get really excited about interplanting and companion planting. And it's something that I think is cool, but I think it's not the place to start. And it's not like even though we're both really into permaculture and into gardening, it's not the most important thing with gardening. And it's a place where a lot of distraction can happen. And so just the fact of you having a garden that has these 10 different vegetables to some degree is intercropping. Like you're not having like a monocrop of anything that's like not what we want. But I just want to preface with that, with when you actually like lay out your beds or make your garden map. But right now we're going to talk about the timing and specific things about each vegetable for this region.
Yeah. And just to add to that, because you mentioned flowers, and if we have time, we can go a little bit into flowers because we both love growing flowers too. A lot of times folks will want to interplant flowers because there are purported pest deterrent qualities, which in my experience is like not really super noticeable. It's not like if I plant a marigold next to a plant, then no bugs are going to eat it. I haven't seen that to be true. But having flowers in your garden, so like at the end of the bed here and then over here, so it's not like in the row with the vegetables, but it's sort of like in interspersed but contained, that will attract pollinators, that will have those same impacts. So kind of just like following up on what Natalie was saying, a garden that size with this many different things is a diversified garden, even if you have everything in blocks, which will make it a lot easier to manage if you have it in blocks. So that's just kind of a bigger picture thing.
And I think we both like having some flowers interspersed in our garden too, because it's just beautiful.
Yeah, it's just pretty.
It makes it nice to be in the garden. It's like, oh, hello, Zinnia. So nice to see you today. Okay, so we're going to get into going through the vegetables, and then we'll revisit some of these bigger picture things. So cabbage, I would say especially I like growing more the Asian cabbages than I do the English cabbages, but you can grow both.
Yeah.
But you would want to, when would you say to put them in the ground? Now. Yeah. So you would want to go ahead and buy transplants and put them in the ground now, rather than starting them from seed. Because if you start them from seed, it's going to be too late. Because it gets hot here really fast. If we were in the Pacific Northwest, you could probably get away with it.
Yeah.
But here it gets hot really fast. Like it's cold now and hot, and then soon it will just be hot. And so those cabbages will kind of stop growing when it gets really hot. And there's also a lot of pest issues that happen with cabbages as the freezing temperatures go away.
Yeah. So I try to get in cabbages like as early as I possibly can, and then deal with if it gets with a little baby. So cabbages most varieties of cabbage can withstand a freeze, but not like we had a couple weeks ago, it was like 9 degrees. They would not be happy with 9 degrees. They would survive, but they wouldn't thrive.
Mhm.
And so when you plant them out, if you do in the next like week or so, have a plan for covering them if we do have another hard freeze, because we very well might. We've noticed over the last few years, the spring temperatures have gotten more and more dramatic. So we got a really hard freeze in May last year. And so just have a plan for floating row covers, or even if it's a small area, like a plastic tote that you can just stick over them and put a rock on top of, it can be something temporary, because they're fine with cool weather. Like if it's a cold day, or even a freezing day, but it's a sunny day, they will be fine. But the overnight hard freeze, like in the 20s or below,
Like
predicted
below 27 degrees,
Yeah.
I think is
Yeah.
technically.
I would cover them, especially when they're little.
And the floating row cover, there's this Agribond is one brand of it, and it's amazing stuff. It works
it's
really
this
well.
white fabric. You can get it at Fifth Season. They sell it, and Lotus, and all of the like home and garden stores around here. You can order rolls of it too. It's pretty affordable. And then you just support it on some sort of, you can just throw it over the plants if it's just for the night, just put it over them and weight it down so it doesn't blow away. And there's various ways to prop it up if you're going to be actually growing underneath it. But
you could learn more about that in the
we have a
gardening
whole
school,
demo and
because
stuff.
we just don't have time.
Yeah. But yeah, getting them in as soon as possible. And then if you have some choice, I don't know what varieties are going to be available where you go now, but shorter season, like I always plant short season summer cabbages, especially with the English cabbages, just because it's so unpredictable and the bugs get bad, and then I want to plant something else there. So there are storage varieties of cabbage that often have names to do with sauerkraut, because they're like for preparation, for fermentation, for storage projects. Those are not the kind to grow in the spring here. Those you can start in the summer and grow into the winter, because they have a longer time at those cooler temperatures. But for the spring, you want short season, like early Jersey Wakefield is a really common, popular variety that has a shorter season.
And Johnny's has a really nice, Johnny's is a seed company, and they have a really nice Asian cabbage called Minuet. That's a hybrid that's very short and like grows very tight and beautiful. I got the variety from a local farmer that is fabulous. But you probably won't find starts of that readily available unless you're buying it from a farm. And once the freezing temperatures go away, if you're having a lot of trouble with these cabbage white butterflies and the resultant worms.
Yeah. So green caterpillars that you can barely see, they're exactly the color of cabbage.
Yeah.
But you'll notice lots of holes and dark green poop.
Yes. Yeah. If you're having that, which is the most common pestilence of cabbage in this area, then spraying BT, which is Bacillus thuringus. It's a naturally occurring soil bacteria, but it's isolated in a lab and bred and stuff. And you spray it at a really low concentration, and it's organic, it's certified organic, and that can be extremely helpful with that. But you want to make sure you don't get any of it on any milkweed plants, because you don't want to be messing with the butterflies or just other plants, because you don't want to be messing with like beneficials, and especially flowers. It would be a good idea to not spray them on the flowers.
That's one of the only pesticides that we use. And it is like, without it, it's really hard to grow cabbage in this region because of those pests. And so it's just used for a short period of time
Mhm.
after it gets hot before they're harvested. And then with the babies for a fall crop before it gets cold enough to kill off the bugs. So it's just kind of like, yeah, but it really will make it a lot easier to do cabbages.
And so we've just talked about cabbages as far as planting them in the spring, but you can also get another crop in the fall. And so if you're wanting to start your own seeds, which of course for the spring, there's not time now, but if you were wanting to start your own seeds for the fall, you would do that in probably early July.
Mhm.
You would sow the seeds and then you would transplant them out in late
August.
July or
Yeah.
early August. And those will be more successful.
Yeah, it's much easier to grow cabbage and then you can grow the bigger like storage varieties of cabbage.
Yeah.
But the same dance with the pests and the freeze is gonna take place on either end, just keeping them enough pest free and keeping them from freezing to death, basically. So yeah, I'm just noticing time and we could talk about cabbage for
we're
probably
gonna
half
move
an
on.
hour, but
We're gonna move on.
we're gonna move on.
And something that I want to mention that's kind of bigger picture for these cool season crops so in this area, you have a chance to plant these cool season crops in the early spring and then again in the late summer or early fall. And so these cool season crops include cabbage, beets from your list. It includes cabbage, beets, carrots, lettuce but it can also grow in the warmth. And yeah, that's all of your crops that you selected that are cool season crops. So if you don't get them in the spring, no problem. You can get them in the fall.
Yeah. And just something that I think a lot of people don't realize is fall gardening starts in the summer.
Yeah.
So if you wait until like September to be like time for my fall garden, it's too late for most things.
Yeah.
So July is really the time to be preparing for and sowing seeds for most crops that are like fall and winter crops.
And that's for this area. If
Yeah.
you are up north, you're going to just be like really far up north where you have huge frost season. You're just going to be growing everything during the summer because that's the only time anything will grow, unless you have a greenhouse. And then if you're like in Florida or South Georgia, you're going to be growing your fall crops just the whole winter. And so it's different depending on where you are. And that's again, something we talk about in the gardening school. So,
do you have any questions about cabbages?
What was the name one more time of that spray for the
BT, Bacillus thuringiensis.
thanks.
And you can find it at any you can find it any gardening store around here. Yeah.
Or
BT.
online.
Yeah. And just a lot of people balk at that because it's actually a bacteria that is genetically modified into some seeds, but spraying it as a pesticide you're not involving yourself with genetic modification. No. It's not the same thing. It's the same bacteria, but it's a totally different use, and it's a naturally occurring soil bacteria, like Natalie said.
Yeah. BT corn is genetically engineered to create it. The plant creates it,
and
which is not what we want. We don't want, nobody please plant BT corn.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Very different.
Moving on. So, and when I mentioned hybrids too, like hybridization happens all the time in nature. And that's just like two different species or two different varieties that are crossed. And that's something that we think is totally fine, but it does make it so you can't save your seed.
Totally other subjects that we get into deeply also in the gardening.
Yeah,
so
but
we're going to try to stay focused.
We're not.
You can tell why we created this like super robust program. There's lots of threads. Yeah. So what's next?
Let's talk about beets or rutabagas.
Okay.
So beets are actually, of these cool season crops, I find that I grow better beets when I plant them in the spring rather than the fall. Whereas carrots and cabbage and all the other brassicas like cabbage, broccoli, blah, 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 those tend to do better in the fall. So beets, we have a favorite variety. If you can find it, Lutz green leaf beet.
LUTZ.
And man, this is juicy for everybody. I'm so happy you all are here because I think there's just a lot of content that's not just for Kat. It's for everybody here. So Lutz green leaf beet. Yeah. And they'll get like, the size of a baby's head, like huge beets. And you're not giving up any flavor. And the leaves are delicious. Yeah. Like they're as good as any chard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Lutz green leaf beets I would say early to mid-April to
Yeah.
sow.
Mhm. Cat.
Oh, the cat.
Yeah, the cat is knocking something
Making
down.
noise.
Not, not you, the actual feline
yeah.
here just made a loud sound. Yeah, early to mid-April to sow. Yeah, they're pretty adaptable.
They're
Like
really
they're
easy.
they're easier. They're one of the easier things to grow here. They don't really deal with a lot of pests in this region. They definitely will grow bigger in higher fertility soil. We didn't mention fertility. Cabbages need, especially English cabbages need a fair amount of fertility. So if you don't have super fertile soil, fertigating, like adding a liquid fertilizer in as you water, can really help as they start getting bigger. They need more nitrogen in particular. And beets are a little more they're just like, I mean,
They're so
definitely
easy.
fertile soil. And if you have super dense clay, then breaking it up a little bit, adding either a bunch of compost or green sand or gypsum or just sand to loosen it up a little bit can be helpful, because obviously, you know, they are growing underground. So if the ground is really dense, then that can inhibit their growth, but they can also help to loosen the soil.
Mhm.
So planting beets can help in that process of building the soil in a way.
And beets, like any other root crop, should be direct sown rather
Yes,
than like
transplanted.
never buy transplants for beets, because if you transplant a beet, it's going to shock the root, which is the part you eat.
Yeah. And
So-
it might start forming when it gets shocked, it might start forming the beet when it's too little. And so it won't ever get that big, because it kind of switches gears into making the big juicy root before the plant is big enough to support that.
Yeah.
So you might see beet transplants, but yeah,
Don't buy them.
with root crops, it's just not worth it.
Yeah. And they can grow up to 3 feet deep. The beet roots, like
Yeah.
it's
Not
pretty.
the part that you eat.
No,
you know,
but
it's
the
not like
roots that extend.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah. So like Chloe's saying, they can really be good for breaking up the soil. So they also germinate relatively quickly. So when you plant them in early to mid-April, you're going to plant them like an inch apart usually, and then every
Really?
seed I like to plant about 2 times as deep in the soil as the seed is wide. So that's like kind of a nice rule. And we, in the online gardening school, we have all these tables that go into how deep to plant everything and the distances, but you can also find a lot of that information on the seed packet. And so you're going to plant them in rows. Usually if you have a bed that's about 3 feet wide, you'll plant 2 to 3 rows of beets, depending on how big they are. And this is one thing that I tend to interplant. Again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for beginners, but with beets, I tend to plant 3 rows of onions. I tend to plant 3 rows of beets, with the beets on the outside, beets in the middle, and then I plant 2 rows of onions in between the beet rows. So I have beets, onions, beets, onions, beets. And that just works really amazingly well, because they use different parts of the soil. And I'm not going to go more into it, even though I would love to in the interest of time. But yeah, beets are just here really, really easy to grow. If you think that you want to store a bunch of beets, or you want to make beet kvass, or you want to make pickled beets or whatever, like that's something, or you want to give them away, or you just love roasting beets, like grow a bunch of them, because they're really easy. And I really find that after, like, I sow them and then I water them until they germinate, and then I wait until they're probably 5 or 6 inches tall, and then I mulch them very heavily, like never with the mulch on top, but always on the sides. And that makes it so that I basically never need to water them or weed them.
Yeah.
But you're going to want to weed them well before you mulch them, because weeds, we like to eat weeds, but they really slow down vegetable growth.
Yeah.
So,
Totally. Selective weed harvesting.
yeah.
But not letting them go right around the vegetables.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we'll mention that throughout, like in your garden that is fairly large, if you're wanting to utilize a lot of space but not get in over your head, doing a few large beds of some of these things would probably be a good way to kind of just, I mean, you can also cover crop some of it, but yeah, the beets and then the beans, we'll talk about them. maybe
the-
not so much the cabbage because it's like you're gonna have to cover them.
That's
So
a
we'll just
pain.
mention, but beets are one that if you want to just do a big bed, because they store well, once you pick them, you just put them in a cool space or in the fridge or give. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
beets. Anything else about beets?
Yeah, they're easy.
Yeah.
Good choice.
Yeah.
Rutabagas, not as easy.
Yeah.
And that's in the fall. And I would say we're not going to talk about them because
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah, I'll talk about it for 2 minutes. Rutabagas and then turnips also, if you're into that. I never grow them in the spring because they're much more sensitive to the heat. So beets are fine in the heat. They get started in the cool, and then when it gets hot, they are pretty. I mean, if it gets super, super hot, they get a little, pathetic looking. But with rutabagas and turnips and all of the brassicas, one of the things that happens when it gets hot is they get really spicy and more bitter, and they're really susceptible to a lot of pests.
and small.
Yeah, and they just don't like it hot. They like cool maritime coast of Great Britain kind of weather.
Or Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, Pacific Northwest. I just say Great Britain because that's where a lot of them are from.
Yeah.
And so turnips and rutabagas would be a fall thing. I've had a lot of success with turnips.
Yeah.
I haven't grown rutabagas as much. Turnips are usually a shorter season. So that's part of why I've had more success. And yeah.
Gold ball turnips.
Yeah, gold ball
are
turnips is great.
delicious.
They're really good and easy to grow. And those would be sown, in July or even as late as August, depending on the year. And then you just kind of like keep them alive while it's still hot, keep the bugs from demolishing them while it's still hot. And then they'll just be stoked
Yeah.
through the cold.
And I've even planted them later than that.
Yeah, they just don't get as big.
I one time sowed turnips in a clear cut and they did fabulously.
Awesome.
It's
Yeah.
just they're
Yeah, in the
amazing.
cool weather, they're very robust. In the warm weather, they just have to,
won't do well. And I'd say the gold ball turnips with the gold ball variety, you kind of get the qualities you'd want out of a rutabaga, but I just find them much easier to grow.
Yeah. And the greens are delicious. All right, moving along.
Carrots. So I've lumped the cool season crops so we
Nice.
can kind of talk about them first, and then we can talk about
Awesome.
the other stuff. And so again, the turnips and the rutabagas you would grow more in the fall. The beets you can grow in the fall, but the Lettuce doesn't do well in the fall. The Lettuce does well in the spring, and beets will just typically do better in the spring. Carrots, you can grow spring carrots, but the fall, I don't grow spring carrots because it's a lot of work. So different plants take different amounts of time to germinate based on the temperature, and carrots germinate much faster in warmer temperatures. And if you sow them in April, then which is when you would sow spring carrots, they can take like 30 days, even commonly 20 days to germinate. And that means you have to keep the soil moist for that long and keep it from growing weeds, which the weeds love to grow that time of year. So it's quite challenging.
Carrots in particular, the seeds need to be moist. Like if they dry out at all, they will not germinate. Other seeds are a little more flexible, like beets. I mean, they can't dry out to be bone dry, but you don't have to water them every single day. The soil moisture is enough and they're a large enough seed. Whereas carrots, you really need to water them every single day. And so in the spring, that's like 20 days of daily watering, and they still might not germinate, and the weeds are germinating. So it's a lot harder. And when carrots are ripening in the hot weather, they tend to be more bitter. And when carrots are ripening in the cool weather, they tend to be super sweet.
Yeah.
And so fall carrots, it's just way better.
Yeah.
Way easier in this region. It's the carrots taste better and they're easier to grow.
And they can keep in the ground all winter if you have a nice layer of mulch on top of them.
Yeah.
And my favorite variety of carrot, which I have not been a big carrot grower. Like I was
Natalie used to make fun of me for growing carrots.
Yeah, it's very funny. And this year I planted 3 giant beds of carrots in the fall because I have been converted to fall carrots. And my favorite variety at this point is the red cord Chantenay. And they're like, really, they're not like a carrot you buy in the store. They're very fat at the top and they're short and they're like a cone shape. And like each carrot of a nice carrot of the red cord Chantenay will be like 4 carrots from the store as far as the weight of like carrot sticks or whatever you could make out of it. Like good flavor.
And that shape, there's several varieties that are that shape. That's also my favorite variety. And that shape tends to be a lot better suited for our soils here in the mountains. So at my farm, we have a lot of rocks. And a lot of folks' gardens around here, there's a lot of heavy clay.
Mhm.
And so those long carrots, that you buy 5 pounds for $5 or whatever ridiculousness are grown in sandier soils. They're grown in really friable, really loose soil. And that's not, I don't know exactly your garden. Maybe it's like super rich and loose, but likely it's not
Yeah.
just because of the amount of clay and rocks that we have in the
Yeah.
mountains here. And so rather than being bummed because we're growing these long skinny carrots and they only get this long, we grow a carrot that's only supposed to grow this long and grows out instead.
Yeah.
So that's like one of the ways that we can choose what we cultivate to be more adapted to our environment rather than trying to get the grocery store shape, color,
Yeah.
size, flavor, and be working against nature. So red cord chantenay, there's other short, squat, fat carrots that you could experiment with.
Danvers.
Yeah, Danvers is great. Yeah, if you do want to grow spring carrots, if for some reason you're feeling super excited about spring carrots, I would recommend a hybrid. And there's a variety called Mokum, M-O-K-U-M, that I get from Fedco Seeds, but I think is pretty readily available. That's very quick maturing. So they're little snacking carrots. They're not like carrots you're going to put in a soup. They're just like snacks in the garden. So if you want to have like, a little bit of a bed for spring carrots, I would recommend that variety or another spring early hybrid variety, because they're just going to do better in those sort of unpredictable spring conditions.
And so I want to mention something about watering. Like when I lived in the Pacific Northwest, I watered my garden throughout the summer because while Washington State, people think it rains all the time, it doesn't rain much at all, like between May and September. Here, Chloe's a little bit different, but I only water my garden when I'm germinating seeds. And so this is something we go into in one of the sections of the online gardening school, which is about watering. And so like you want to keep that seed moist until it germinates. And like Chloe was saying, some seeds are more sensitive than others, but like basically if a seed dries out while it's germinating, it will die. But here in the Southern Appalachians, it rains a lot in the green season, which means that we have a lot of pests, and we have a lot of molds, and we have a lot of blights, but it also means we don't have to water our gardens much. But that said, if you are trying to grow spring carrots, that's one place where you might even want to set up drip irrigation so that you can actually make sure that it gets watered on a timer every day.
Yeah.
And yeah, fall carrots, love them.
Yeah. Any questions thus far? Carrots beets rutabagas? Cool.
No, that was super helpful. And thanks for the turnip hint on a turnip that's like a rutabaga.
Yeah, gold ball turnips.
Another, just because you're saying, I'm imagining you like a nice tray of roasted roots or something. Parsnips are another great one. We're not going to get into talking about it, but you would sow those pretty soon too. They're a long season and sown usually in the early spring.
In April.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm like roots. Yeah, sweet potato. You can grow sweet potatoes here, but I digress.
Yes.
Let's continue.
Yes, and we like your
yeah, nice and simple.
Brief, simple plan here. Okay, so lettuce. There are lots of different varieties of lettuce. So there's lettuces that do well. That do well in the heat, and there's lettuces that do well in the cold. I had lettuces under floating row cover the entire winter this year, which we didn't get. Well, I think the lowest we got was like 5 or something, 5 degrees Fahrenheit. But when it goes down to -5, you just can't do it.
Yeah.
But so there's tons of varieties. There's varieties that make heads, and then there's varieties where you cut and come again. You just like sew like a band of them and cut them. I like to grow both. This time of year is great to put in transplants of the heading varieties. And pretty soon here, you can sow bands of the cut leaf varieties.
Yeah. Yeah. And lettuce that is not well adapted for the heat will not do very well here in the summer, because it gets too hot for most lettuce varieties, for many lettuce varieties. So if you want to grow lettuce through the summer, make sure you choose like a summer lettuce variety, a heat tolerant lettuce variety. In the spring and fall, kind of like any, cold tolerant is better, but it's a little more flexible for lettuce.
Yeah. And I tend to plant my lettuce. So there's this thing called succession planting. And did I pronounce that right?
Mm-hmm.
I always like mix up like succession.
I think it's like seceding from the Texas, seceding as its own country.
Okay.
Succession.
Succession. So I tend to plant successions of lettuce. And like if I was a farm and I was selling lettuce, I would probably plant a succession every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But as it is, being just like a home gardener, I plant a succession probably once a month or every 5 weeks or something like that. And especially if I'm growing the cutting varieties, because the cutting varieties, you mow them like with scissors to the ground, and then they come back up and make more. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So you can kind of get a couple successions out of one planting. But yeah, I right now have butter lettuces and oak leaf lettuces in the ground that I actually bought transplants because I was out of town when I would have started them. And I have them in the ground under floating row cover. And then in probably 2 weeks, I will be sowing, what's my favorite lettuce? Rocky Top cutting lettuce. And I will sow a succession of Rocky Top cutting lettuce throughout the spring and summer. And then I'll plant some really winter
marvel.
Yeah, totally. Winter marvels. I'll probably start those in September, I'd say.
Yeah.
And then, not that you love cilantro, but I love cilantro. And I basically do this exact same thing with cilantro. And cilantro, by the way, under floating row cover, survived the entire winter. It is hardy to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have it covered, it's going to survive like pretty low temperatures here.
Yeah.
Like way below 18 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I
about
don't think
lettuce?
there's anything else to say about lettuce, really. I will say, since you made like lettuce and greens in general, a lot of folks are into mesclun mix, which is mostly brassicas, like arugula and different mustards and things like that. I haven't had great success with that in this climate because of those same things that we mentioned with the brassicas not liking the heat and the bugs really coming in. If you just like have to have a mesclun mix, early spring and just a little window in the fall would probably be the only times to do them. Arugula can do really well. I usually plant it in the fall and it will overwinter too. So just the arugula, and even spring arugula, I just haven't had very much success because there's it bolts and there's flea beetles that kind of perforate it into lace. So however, what you mentioned with the Malabar spinach, like leaning into those sort of alternative greens are a great love of both Natalie and I. So the Malabar spinach, and then also New Zealand spinach is another one. There is magenta spreen, which is a lamb's quarter variety. It's like a cultivar of lamb's quarters. It does well. It's also spinachy
and beautiful.
Yeah. It's
like
just,
6 feet tall.
As pretty
gorgeous.
as a flower.
Yeah.
And will self-seed. You can just like, if you plant that in an area where you can just let it sort of establish a patch, it'll self-seed and it'll just come back up the next year. It'll become a little bit of a weed, but it's easy to weed out. And then there's some like callaloo and different amaranths that can be edible leaf amaranths that can be a little trickier to get going.
Yeah.
But I find them to be tasty and big and beautiful and delicious too. So just to speak to that, like alternative greens, and then the weeds too. We love chickweed salad, for example, and cover crop. Austrian winter pea cover crop is a great spring salad. So just like thinking outside of the box of lettuce for your salad greens is fun and nutritious.
Yeah. And chickweed is probably the most nutritious plant in your entire garden, which is a trip.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can also have lettuce all year long here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
we should move on.
And with the mesclun thing, if you live in the Pacific Northwest, or like California,
coastal California,
Maine,
places
go
where
for
it's
it.
like more predictably cool for any length of time. Here it's just
up down.
Not.
Oh no.
Oh, I didn't do it with the wild abundance one. How is that possible?
Okay.
Okay.
Do I have a way to get to it?
That's so weird.
Zoom. I'll just go to Zoom.
I can go to Zoom here
Okay.
too. That's that bummer. Whoops. Again. Whoops.
Do you think we kicked off everybody?
Yeah.
Oh shit.
I can still hear you.
Oh, you can hear us.
Yeah.
Great.
Weird. Okay. Well, I don't know what just happened. You can still hear us. Can you see us?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Well,
Great.
so there you are.
There you
okay.
are. Okay.
We
Great.
just got a message like Zoom 40-minute link. I was like,
No, we pay for it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Okay,
can
so
still
moving
hear it.
on. What's that? You can hear it? Okay, great.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know. Technological glitch that happens in life. So what are we doing after lettuce?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I'm here staring at weird stuff. Okay. So now we're going to, let's talk about alliums. So you had mentioned bunching onions. I haven't had great luck with there's Egyptian walking onions. Have you had much luck with bunching
Yeah,
onions?
Charles, can you mute? Sorry, you're just like popping up as the main person talking and we want to see Kat again.
And we appreciate you telling
Yes,
us that
thank
you
you.
can hear us. Thank you.
Oh, I guess you are muted.
Huh.
Maybe when
Kat,
Kat starts
do you
talking.
mind saying something?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Cool.
Here you go.
For the
Nice.
recording, so we're not seeing a black screen.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, yeah, bunching onions. Yeah. I've had more,
Chives.
yeah, chives and perennial onions.
Yeah.
Do pretty well. And there's an amazing collection of different kinds of unusual alliums from our friends at Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. That's like one of their specialties. And they're just over in Virginia. And in terms of a seed company that has advice and seeds that are like really well adapted to our larger bioregion, they are the ones to go to.
They're very experienced.
Yeah,
Really
and awesome folks. Yeah. So alliums, unusual alliums for the Southeast, Southern Exposure, seed, what is it? Southern Exposure Seed Cooperative?
Seed Exchange.
Thank you.
And if you, so you're in a rental, so you won't necessarily be gardening again there. But I find that I often forget to harvest a few onions in the field, and then they come up with green tops the next year. And I'm like, awesome, this is great. And I harvest those. And when I used to live in Spain, they would actually do that intentionally. They would have calçots, which was like the second year of the onion growth. And they would specifically harvest the tops, and they're awesome. But chives, yeah,
I'll definitely do lots of chives. So we got some red onions and shallots. We planted some of the shallots in the fall, and they're popping up green. But we didn't get to the red onions, and we didn't do any more. Is it too late now to plant them for like spring onions, or did we need to do that in the fall?
No, we don't usually overwinter onions in this region. So spring is usually when we plant the onions.
and we usually do starts instead of the bulbs, the little bulbs.
Yeah.
Okay.
So actually little onion plants from seed. We grow the seed usually, but you can buy onion plants too. They just tend to do better because we're kind of on the edge. So onions are day length sensitive. They're like short day, long day, and day neutral onions. So that's the numbers of hours of daylight that they experience while they're growing will trigger them to go from just a plant into making that bulb. That is what we're going for. And so when you get the bulbs to start, they can just be a little more finicky in terms of that. And we're already on the edge of the day length. And so we've had better success with onion plants than onion starts. But if you have them, sure, I would plant them like in the next few weeks, watching
As soon as possible.
Yeah. And I just want to say a caveat of like the timing, like we say early April, but of course, maybe this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it, look at the weather forecast. And so if you're like, okay, early April, I'm going to plant my onions on April 7th. And then in the forecast, a hard freeze is coming April 9th. I would wait to plant if it's going to get like super, super cold right after you plant something, because if you're direct sowing, nothing's going to start germinating if there's a hard freeze like a couple days out. So, be in touch with what's actually happening in the weather. The timing that we're sharing and that any calendar will share is just sort of a framework that you can jump off of, being in touch with your actual weather.
And with onion starts, which I tend to buy, they have them at Reams Creek Nursery right now. You could go buy onion starts. And I tend to have much more success if I plant them like mid-March, and now would be great than if I wait much longer to plant them. I just get bigger bulbs.
Yeah. But I would, the ones that you have, sure, plant them and
see what happens.
The worst that could happen is that they flower instead of making a bulb. And onion flowers are incredible beneficial attractors, and they're pretty. So it's not a bad thing if that happens.
And it's interesting because most old timers tend to plant the little bulbs.
Yeah.
Which I don't know why, but I've had better luck with the starts.
Yeah. The weather used to be less erratic too.
Yeah.
So maybe
that's interesting.
They work better.
Yeah, totally. Well, let's go to, are you good? Any questions?
Good. Let's go. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. If you can come up with questions after us talking that much, it's impressive.
Yeah.
Okay. So tomatoes, we love tomatoes.
Yes.
We love them. They are they come from the tropics, and there they are perennial, but here, of course, they are annual. And there's different types of tomatoes. There's saucing tomatoes, and then there's slicing tomatoes. And so Chloe and I both tend to grow lots and lots of canning tomatoes because we like to make tomato sauce and canned tomatoes and such. I used to do a ton of food preservation. And at this point, the only food preservation I tend, except for just sticking beetroots in the root cellar and such like that, and sauerkraut. Well, I guess I do still do
But not
food
as much.
preservation, but
Yeah.
as far as canning vegetables, tomato sauce is the only thing I still do.
Yeah.
But so I grow about 40 plants of canning tomatoes, and then I grow like 7 or 8 slicers
Mhm.
because you don't need that many slicing tomatoes because it's like, what are you going to do with them? And if you try to make tomato sauce out of slicing tomatoes, you're just cooking down forever to
Yeah.
try to get it into a thick sauce. And so sometimes I'll throw a slicer or 2 in there, but generally not advised.
Good for
And-
making tomato juice.
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
point.
I've
And
done
then
that.
there's dual purpose tomatoes, which Chloe has found my favorite dual
Yeah.
purpose tomato.
So the one that I like to grow is called West Virginia 63. It's sort of an unexciting name, but here in our region, because of the rain and the wet and the amazing, beautiful fungal diversity in the forests, late blight, which is a fungal disease that comes from the soil and infects tomato plants, is like a big issue. And it's really easy to lose tomato plants mid-season to blight. And the West Virginia 63 is blight resistant.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it doesn't get blight. It definitely still gets blight, but it gets it less and later. And it's a nice dual purpose. So I like it on a BLT. It's fine for a slicer, but it's fleshy enough that it also makes a good sauce. And I just, over the years, like tomatoes, kind of like lettuce, if you look through a seed catalog, it's like hundreds of varieties and they all sound amazing. But what I found in this region is a lot of the amazing sounding tomatoes don't do that well here because of the fungal load that we experience. And, how many tomato sandwiches am I going to have versus making tomato sauce, making salsa, these kinds of things that the West Virginia 63 works really well for. Cherry tomatoes also, I always grow at least 2 or 3 plants of sun gold cherry tomato in particular, which is a hybrid. And there's lots of amazing heirloom, non-hybridized tomato varieties, but the sun gold just is really delicious. It's like candy. It's amazing. All the children love, like if your neighbors have little children, they will come and pick sun golds for sure. So that's the cherry tomato that I would recommend. And then just whatever else, like Cherokee purple is good, like brandy white, like whatever slicers you want to, and you have more variety specific with that. But
I like this speckled Roman, which is actually a sauce tomato, but it's just beautiful. But at this point, I'm not growing very many of them because the West Virginia 63 and the blight varies from year to year too. Like sometimes, like a couple of years ago, all my tomatoes were pretty much around like in September because it just was a relatively dry summer. Whereas last year, all my tomatoes got knocked out except for the West Virginia 63s in like July or something. And then the West Virginia 63s lasted until the frost. So yeah, and you need to trellis your tomatoes. That's really important.
Yeah.
In this region.
Yeah. So there are determinate and indeterminate varieties, and determinate means they grow to a certain height and then they kind of stop vegetatively growing. They'll still flower and fruit, but their harvest window is smaller. And indeterminate are like vining plants that just keep vining and vining. And so both need support, both need trellises, but with indeterminate varieties, they need a sturdier, bigger trellis.
Mm-hmm.
And the West Virginia 63s are kind of somewhere in the middle. Like they don't vine out and get enormous 8 feet long, but they are not a determinate variety.
And they have a long harvest window. And
Yeah.
that's like, so the vining tendency is determined to some degree by the determinate or indeterminate. But I think what defines determinate or indeterminate is if the fruit mostly all comes at once, that's a determinate variety. And if the fruit comes slowly over time, that's an indeterminate variety. And ideally, your saucing tomatoes are, which the West Virginia 63s are not, but they tend to, it's better if they're determinate, because then you get a big batch all at once to make a bunch of sauce with. And it's better if your slicers are indeterminate, because then you get slicers over a little bit over time, because you know, how many BLTs do you want in 1 week?
Well, I mean,
yeah, you can have a party. We're gonna have a tomato sandwich party.
Yeah. A couple of other things about growing tomatoes in this region. So part of the way that we deter the blight, the blight always wins, but part of the way we kind of hold it off is trellising and then pruning off leaves so that there's a lot of airflow. So airflow and sunlight are not friends of fungus. So if there's a lot of airflow and it's really, tomatoes just do better in full sun. But not crowded with other plants around them, really like a lot of airflow, a lot of sunlight, and then mulching. We're proponents of mulching all like not leaving soil uncovered anywhere in the garden, but with tomatoes, especially, because what happens is the raindrops splash soil, if it's not unmulched, up onto the leaves, and the soil is what carries the blight. And so that's how the plants originally get infected with the blight, is from soil contact. So if you have thick mulch of like dry leaves or straw or whatever you have on hand, then there's less of a chance for the splattering rain to make contact between the leaves and the soil. So those are the main, and then if you have plants that get blight, pruning off the leaves and like washing your hands, trying not to spread it around, but it's like, once it's here, it's here. It's not like you're going to overcome it, but those are just some management strategy. And also never overhead watering tomatoes. Tomatoes shouldn't need to be watered after they're transplanted. So here in this region, because it rains in the summer, thanks.
Yeah.
But even in like I lived and grew in Santa Cruz, California, where also it doesn't rain all summer. And there are folks who dry farm tomatoes. There's technique to it. It's not like you just don't water, but they also have very, very, very deep roots. They can have very, very deep roots, and they're sweeter, and they tend to do better without a lot of water. So folks, commercial growers around here always grow them under cover, so they aren't rained on, and they get less, they irrigate them underneath, but they just don't need a lot of water, and they don't like overhead water.
But
so,
we don't do that.
Yeah, we don't do that. I would if I had a greenhouse. But so you never want to overhead water them, and it's likely that you won't have to water them after, like, transplant them, water them deeply, and then, but pay attention to the weather. If it's like weeks and weeks and weeks without water, you might want to give them a little water, but you probably will not have to water your tomatoes, and they'll be better for it.
Yeah.
In this region where it rains, typically at least, once a week in the summer, if not every day.
If you're in Arizona, water your tomatoes.
Yeah, but not as much as other things.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
I had one question, because I definitely want to grow some type of a canning tomato, and was curious. I mean, how many plants should I grow to have, like, a decent amount of tomato sauce that I can put away?
20.
I was going to say like 5 or 10. It depends on how many you want to deal with, but yeah, how much canning you want to do. Yeah. But somewhere between 5 and 20.
Yeah. And she could grow like 50, but
yeah. But not, I mean, I'm adjusting. Yeah. But yeah, 20 for sure. You'll have plenty. You might be overwhelmed. Maybe start with like 10 or 15.
And if you space the tomato plants with more space, they'll produce more.
Yeah.
Too. So it's an interesting thing. And that's something in the online gardening school too. We have really awesome, very specific videos about tomato trellising. And I would say the Florida weave is something commercial tomato growers use around here. And that is one of the successful tomato trellising ways. There's another way that Chloe and I both use, but it would take more explanation than we have time for.
Yeah.
here.
And I'm just going to put a link in the chat to a blog post on our website that I wrote that kind of overviews the different methods. But we can move on.
Yeah.
If that's all your questions about tomatoes.
And we
Yeah,
don't recommend tomato cages.
Yeah.
Tomato cages are great for peppers. Not so much for, but other things to peppers. Oh, and moving on to peppers. So
Mhm.
peppers really like to be trellised too, because otherwise they fall down and then the peppers tend to rot. So definitely trellis your peppers. You could use tomato cages to trellis them. You could use the Florida weave method, which if you look that up on the internet, there'll be all sorts of information on it. Although I don't know if any of it's as good as that in the online gardening school. But
Even just a stake per plant, I'll do if it's not that many plants.
oh, for peppers,
For
totally.
peppers,
Yeah.
because it's not as much with peppers. It's kind of like they are not a vine. They're not naturally a vine, whereas tomatoes naturally are a vine. They just have been bred to have so many heavy fruits that they can't support themselves often. And because it is windy and rainy here, like in other regions, like in New Mexico, where they grow lots and lots of chilies and peppers, they don't trellis them. And it is kind of crazy weather there, but not so much in the summer. Yeah. And they're closer together in big fields. My point is peppers aren't going to grow to be 6 or 8 feet tall like tomato plants will. So you don't need a giant trellis in the same way. You basically need something for them to like lean on so they don't fall over. So even just like a bamboo stake with each plant, if you have 5 pepper plants, you don't need to do a whole elaborate trellis. You can just give them 1 or 2 stakes and then tie the middle stem onto that.
Yeah. Especially the bell peppers, like definitely need support. The hot peppers tend to not need as much as support.
And generally speaking, hot peppers are more hardy and robust and
way easier to
grow.
But you only need 1 or 2.
Unless
Hot
you're like
pepper
having
plants.
a hot sauce
Yeah.
party.
Yeah.
Even
So-
then, you might only need 1 or 2.
Yeah. So they make a lot of hot peppers.
Yeah.
Whereas, and with peppers also, with bell peppers, it's a really good idea to look for shorter season varieties.
Yeah. For this region.
If you're in California or you're in New Mexico or you're in Georgia, you don't need short season, but here for sure.
Yeah. Because they take a long time to mature. And so with peppers, if you're wanting to grow from seed yourself, you could start seeds now and still have a harvest, but not in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Like you need to start them pretty early or by transplants.
Yeah.
But they take a long time to mature. You planting them as soon as it's warm and not going to freeze, and then you don't harvest them until the early fall, really late summer. They are also susceptible to a lot of the same fungal kinds of issues and pest kinds of issues that tomatoes are.
But not as bad.
Yeah, not as bad, but definitely they're a little finickier than some other things.
They also, you really don't want to put those out until it's hot. So not even like the last frost date, but waiting until like
It's actually hot. Yeah.
out.
So peppers and eggplants both, even though they don't die at cold temperatures, they can get stunted at temperatures under about 45 degrees. So it can be exciting. You're like, I'm ready to put my peppers out, but they actually their entire life of growth will be stunted. And so it's not worth it.
Yeah. I tend to put mine out a week or 2 after I put out my tomatoes.
Yeah.
Because tomatoes, as long as it doesn't freeze, they're fine. Peppers, and they will die. Peppers will die in freezing temperatures, just to clarify.
Yeah.
But the 31 or 32 or whatever to 45 is stunting land. So we don't want
and
that.
tomatoes just like won't grow when it's cold, but not freezing. But then as soon as it's warm again, they just keep growing.
Yeah.
They're a little more adaptable to temperature wise. I really like the Ashe County pimento. It's an heirloom that's from Ashe County, which is right around here. And they're small pimento, like about this big, and very thick walled and very sweet, and have a long harvest window. And I have had really, really good luck with them. They're not like a big blocky bell pepper like you might buy in the store, but I don't really care.
If you're looking for more of that, the Ace pepper from Johnny's, which is a hybrid, is a very short season, big blocky pepper, but it's relatively thin walled, which is not as fun. And then
Carolina Wonder is another blockier. California Wonder is like one of the main commercial bell peppers that you find in the store, and Carolina Wonder is sort of like the Carolina version of that was bred for more of our region. And then spicy pepper. Yeah, we could talk about pepper varieties for a long time, but Southern Exposure Seed Exchange
Yeah.
has a lot of great pepper varieties for this region, for this bioregion.
And tomatoes.
And tomato, yeah, they're great.
Yeah.
But they're fun to peruse and kind
Yeah.
of like get a feel for varieties that might do well around here.
And they have really nice sweet potato slips.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If you happen to want to grow
Yeah.
sweet potatoes, but we're not
We're,
gonna
we're
talk
not
about that
talking
'cause-
about sweet potatoes.
Any
So-
questions about peppers before we move on?
Well, so you mentioned eggplant and kind of treating them like peppers, and I know we don't want to dive into it, but I had the only other similar thing I would like to try is a tomatillo. And can I
Oh, yeah.
treat that like a tomato?
Yeah, they
Or
don't
pepper?
grow the same way. So trellis, they do need support, but they grow more like a giant pepper in their habit. Like it's more like with a main stalk and then branching out rather than vining like a tomato. So trellising them can be they just can get unwieldy.
You don't want to prune them like you do a tomato. You want
Yeah.
them to let them go like this. And a cattle panel works really well for,
Yeah. And a tomato cage honestly can be okay for
Oh, yeah.
tomatillos
that's a
because
good
they're
point.
this big bushy thing. And so tomato cages can work well for tomatillos.
And tomato cages can work for tomatoes in other regions. It's just here where it's so moist.
Yeah,
Like they
the
can
airflow.
just make it blight city.
But Florida
and-
weed wouldn't work well for tomatillo, or would the Florida
not
weed?
really because they're more three-dimensional.
Oh, I see. Okay.
They're bigger and more three-dimensional. In my experience,
Yeah.
I prefer something more three-dimensional.
So there is a tomatillo variety from Adaptive Seeds, which is in Oregon, that I grew last year. And I'm struggling. I think it's called like giant green lantern or something. And they are giant. They're like this big for tomatillos. Like and it's so prolific. Like I grew 2 plants and I had tomatillos. Like I ended up composting lots of them because I just didn't have
Yeah.
capacity, and they were really tasty too. So I'd really recommend that. That seed company also is not bioregional, but they have amazing seeds. And anyone living in the Pacific Northwest, like Adaptive Seeds.
Yeah, I'm gonna write it
awesome.
in the chat just in case people don't hear.
And yeah, so also if you have kids nearby that are going to come browsing,
Mhm.
Aunt Molly's ground cherries
Oh,
are
yeah.
amazing.
I might
So
have-
good. They're like one of my favorite things in my garden. And my daughter has her own garden beds, and she people will ask her about what she grows, and she's like, "Oh, I mostly grow ground cherries, and I love ground cherries and blah blah." And she'll just like go on and on about it, and they're just delicious. Highly recommend them. So now
Yeah, let's continue.
Malabar
Yeah.
spinach,
Cool.
which you grew last year.
Yeah, and it did really well, and it was nice to just like pick as much as you wanted for that day and then let it keep going.
It needs really warm weather to germinate.
Yeah, and it may reseed. If you saw it making flowers and seeds, you may notice them popping up once it gets hot.
But not till like late June, even mid to late June.
Yeah.
It's weird. It's bizarre.
It needs warm soil, and the soil doesn't get hot until then.
It causes stomach problems for me, I realized, which
Oh,
is a
bummer.
bummer.
Yeah.
Because it's just amazing. It's so prolific. Like one plant can take over an entire bed of like vining edible greens. It's so awesome. And in the middle of
Yeah.
the summer, it's very cool.
Yeah, so I feel like we kind of already, unless you have specific questions, we kind of, when we were talking about lettuce, talked about a couple of other kind of unconventional greens that do well, especially in the heat here. So yeah, I feel like we can move on.
Yeah.
Greens. Dry beans.
Why don't you start with that?
I
'Cause
love
she's
growing
the
dry
expert.
beans, and it's kind of hard to do in this region. I hate to tell you. We have a pest called the Mexican bean beetle that comes in around June or sometimes July, and will just completely decimate bean plants. So sorry to start with a bummer of a story. Dry beans are amazing and wonderful, and growing them yourself, if you just have this world of color and texture and flavor and stories. And so I very much encourage and support you. They take up a lot of space to get a significant amount of harvest. And so that's another one, like the beets, where if you're like, okay, we're going to like intensively manage, 2 of these beds. I don't know exactly the dimensions of your beds. But we want to have garden in the rest of them. Like, so 2 whole beds are going to be bean or whatever it's going to be, because you need a fair amount of space to get a significant harvest, like a lot of space. And So you can grow bush beans or you can grow pole beans. So bush beans are little bushy plants that you don't need to be trellised, and pole beans need something to climb up, and they climb up spiraling like this. So they need a pole or a string or something that they can twine around, not a fence panel or a string going horizontally that they can climb on like a ladder. Peas climb like a ladder, beans climb like a pole. You definitely want to go for a shorter season variety. So I like to get my dry beans from Fedco Seeds, which is up in Maine, because they, even though we have a longer amount of heat, we have a short amount of time before the beans come and totally defoliate all the plants.
The bean beetles.
The bean beetles, yeah. Thank you.
No.
And so shorter season varieties are what I've had more success with than longer season. Even though we have the heat for longer season, we don't have the time.
And we recently learned that if you grow the bush varieties, that you can cover them with a floating row cover as long as it's really well sealed, and that will keep the bean beetles out, but you have to uncover them once they start to flower so they can be pollinated.
Yeah.
And Chloe was talking about area. So this is like 3 cups of beans. This, and I have more of these, but this is from one like 3 foot by 12 foot bed.
Okay.
I got this much beans, you know, which is like a cool, like, and if you have a bunch of space, you can grow a good number of beans, but it's like, you know, this is, and they're really beautiful. I don't know if you can see them, but
Yeah.
this is the old Mother Stollard variety, which I
Oh,
like.
nice.
I mean, but yeah.
Yeah, beans don't need a lot of fertility. They fix nitrogen. So green beans and all kinds of beans, all kinds of legumes. So they can be a good option for if there's like a part of your garden that is just less rich, then growing beans there can be a good choice. Pole beans tend to produce quite a bit more, like you'll get a more overall harvest, but you have to build a sturdy trellis for them. There's lots of different ways to do that, but just like judging, you know, your time and the materials that you have on hand, and, you know, bush beans may be a better choice. Most commercial dry beans are bush beans because they're harvested with machines, and it's just like a huge giant field and they're not going to be trellising. But most dry beans, many varieties of dry beans on more of like a home garden or small farm scale, pole beans just produce more for the amount of ground area.
Yeah. And I think there's less, to some degree, less pests. Like you can, aside from not being able to cover them, like you can see the pests and you can
they're
see
much
the
easier to
beans
harvest.
better. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some varieties of beans that are all-purpose bean, and so you can eat them as green beans and you can eat them as dry beans. That can be nice if you have really limited space, but if what you're going for is a nice harvest of dry beans, I wouldn't choose one of those varieties, because I would just, you know, you want as many as you can to mature to be dry beans to harvest and then cook and eat. Yeah, anything else about dry beans? I wouldn't recommend, a lot of people get excited about doing a 3 sisters planting. So having the beans climb up corn plants, which is part of a whole rich and complex and beautiful, many different rich and complex and beautiful farming cultural practices in a lot of native cultures in Mesoamerica and even here in North America. But it's not so simple as just plant a bean and plant corn and it'll be like your natural trellis. There's a lot of, there's particular varieties that are well adapted to that. There's a lot having to do with timing
And climate. And this
climate. Yeah. So I wouldn't recommend that to beginners. And I don't do that. I don't do that in general. I don't find that it works very well
in this region
without that whole bigger cultural container and ritual timing. And it's like actually very complex. People kind of like to simplify it and like, oh, this is this great thing. And it's actually a very complex thing to do well. So, yeah. Anything else about beans?
And especially here, because we have so much moisture, like having all these plants touching each other, and it's just not. Beans are fun.
Yeah.
Love them. Oh, one thing is that there are some Southern traditions of not dry beans, but like harvesting beans when they are not fully dry and cooking them as like fresh dry beans, where you like cook dry beans. They're called shelly beans usually. And so that's not something I've done a lot of, but it's pretty cool. And then also cowpeas.
Yeah. So black-eyed peas and cowpeas are kind of like the whole family. Black-eyed peas are one variety or one type. but there's tons and tons of varieties. Again, Southern Exposure has a lot of seed
Mhm.
available. They are much less susceptible to the bean beetles, and they can do great here. So at one point I was like, I'm just going to stop growing Phaseolus vulgaris, which is the genus and species of the common bean, which is like pinto, black bean, probably what you're thinking of and referring to when you're saying dry beans for cooking. But cowpeas, you might have a lot more success with. So if you like black-eyed peas and you want to play around with them, that is a great avenue to explore.
Yeah.
And they're much less susceptible to those pests here.
Mhm.
And they love the hot and the wet, and they're just more adapted to this climate.
And cowpeas in general are also used, which black-eyed pea is a type of cowpea. They are, I think,
Mhm.
and they are used as a cover crop in the
Mhm.
summer because they're so prone to doing great. But if you're wanting to grow them as a cover crop, you want to harvest the plant, cut the plant down when it's flowering, not after it's gone to seed, because then it's not giving as much back to the soil.
Yeah.
So now butternut squash.
So I picked butternut because it was, I think, the only squash that didn't get the, like, what do you call it when the stem kind of,
And borers.
yes.
Yeah.
So
Well, we might even have a better variety for you than butternut that's very closely related.
But yeah, the butternut family. So there's 5 species of squash, of like winter squash and summer squash, that are most cultivated. 3 of them are more commercially cultivated. The other 2 are more just bioregionally in places where they came from. I'm not going to go into a whole treatise on squash, but so Cucurbita is the genus, and then Moschata is the species of the butternut type, and Maxima is the species of like the buttercup type. And most of the really big, like blue
Candy
cupboards
roaster.
and candy roasters, most of the really big ones. And then Pepo is the species of most summer squashes, so zucchinis and yellow crookneck and all of that, and also delicatas, and also most pumpkins, like carving pumpkins, pie pumpkins are usually Pepos.
Except Seminole pumpkins.
Yeah, this is like loose, like the word pumpkin can refer to a lot of them.
Yeah.
But the Cucurbita moschata, which is the species of the butternut, tends to be the most disease resistant
Mhm.
and does the best here.
You figured that
So
out.
good
Nice.
choice with that.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of varieties. There are a lot of varieties within that, other than just the straight up like Waltham buttercup. And one of them that we really
Butternut.
love is called, Waltham butternut.
Yes.
Butternut,
Because there's buttercup and
Yeah. So one that we have really found does really well here is called the Seminole pumpkin. And it was a main food crop of Creek speaking Seminole folks in the Everglades, like in southern Florida.
Mhm.
And their name for it, Chassahowiska, means tree hanging pumpkin. So it would like vine out and climb up and basically be trellised in trees. It can grow like 40 feet, the vines.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a longer season, which can be a little problematic here, but it's delicious and super, super, super robust.
and they last for like 2 years, whereas some like butternuts can like start molding after like a few months or
Yeah.
whatever. And it's really great if you can get Seminole pumpkins that have been selected for an area with a shorter growing season, because like they're the most disease resistant here. But like when I go out, when it's going to be the first frost of the season, and I go to hunt for all of my Seminole pumpkins that are still, in their foliage that hasn't died back, like all of the other squash that has so many pests and stuff, a lot of them are not mature. And so, is there public access to that seed variety
Oh yeah, to the other one, to the short.
Yeah.
I can't remember where we got it, but where did we get it? I can't remember. So several years ago, I crossed the Seminole pumpkin with this Lofthouse landrace moschata. This man in Utah basically just got every moschata seed that he could and selected just for early maturing. So didn't care the size, didn't care the shape, early maturing. And so I crossed those with the Seminole pumpkin several years ago to try and get some of those qualities of the Seminole pumpkin and the earlier maturing. And so I have a bunch of those seeds, but you could do a similar thing yourself. Basically just saving seed, winter squash. Yeah, Lofthouse landrace. Yeah. Where is
So
it?
the Lofthouse landrace
Yeah.
is the one that
Yeah, it's quick maturing.
quick maturing.
Yeah, and Adaptive Seeds has one that they've basically been doing a similar thing with, like, how can we, because generally speaking, Moshatas take longer to mature. The Seminole pumpkin is like an extreme because it's from Florida, or what we now call Florida. But so other people are in this gig of trying to get Moshatas that will ripen a little quicker. So Adaptive Seeds is a good place to look. I'm sure anything that they have is awesome. And you can play around with different varieties of different Moshata varieties that aren't necessarily called butternut, but are going to be that like tawny, hard, smooth skin. A lot of them have the long neck. Some of them don't. The Seminole pumpkins are more of a pumpkin shape. But yeah, those are definitely the winter squash to play around with.
And this variety is available. I've never heard of the seed company Giving Ground Seeds.
Yeah.
It sounds cool.
Yeah.
But it's available from them, and there's different shapes and sizes because it's a landrace. It's all these mixed things, and
Yeah.
It's
So a
pretty fun.
landrace, just to keep my teacher hat on for one more minute, a landrace is basically, it's not like a named variety in the sense like butternut, like Waltham's butternut is always going to look pretty much the same, no matter who grows it, no matter where. And a landrace is more like a variety that's been adapted in a particular place for certain characteristics, but not for other characteristics. So it does well in this place and it matures early, but we don't care, you know, what color it is, what size it is. It's sort of like more of a the people's way of breeding vegetables in a way, you know, like, and land races exist all around the world, even if it's the same variety that's just been saved over and over again in the same region. Seeds will carry the stories of their experience and start to adapt. That's a whole nother bigger conversation I would love to have, but we're not going to have right now.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to wrap it up. Do you have any questions? I know that's a huge amount of information. Just like big picture questions or.
No, I don't think so. I think my big question that came to me today was I found these red onions and shallots and was like, I need to make sure I ask them about what to do with that. So that answered that question. And
Cool.
I took lots of notes. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah.
That's
And we'll
awesome.
send the recording to everybody. And so if you need to refer back to it.
Yeah, and you bringing up the shallots it brings up, like, I was at this local health food store called Earth Fair yesterday, and they have this big display of like shallot seeds, or like, which are not
Bulbs,
little bulbs to plant. And this is not the time of year to plant them. And it's interesting because sometimes, like, you go to the store, you'd think that they would have on display the things that you should plant right then. But in fact, even some of these better like gardening specific stores will be putting stuff out that it's, if you planted them, then they would die, you know? So it's not something that you can always trust.
Yeah. And so the online gardening school, we have good timing there. If you're not going to sign up, or you're not, if you're not going to sign up, the way that I get the best information on timing for a bioregion is to either talk to a local organic farmer, which you can do often at the farmer's market, you know, buy a few things and, you know, have a few minutes of their time if the booth is not too crazy busy, obviously respecting that. And also seed companies that are locally adapted, that are bioregionally based. So for our region, Southern Exposure has some good planting charts, and they have one for like where they are down in Virginia and one for like the mountains. And we would be the mountains. That gives a really good general view. So if you have a seed company that's in your bioregion, their charts are going to be better than some random, you know, like national or like the grocery store or whatever it is.
And the extension service.
Yeah, extension service, totally.
But yeah, those can all be good, but it can also be good. Like the gardening school, I think, is just, I have this opinion because we put a lot of work into it, but it's very robust and really trustable. But like, I wouldn't necessarily trust all local seed companies.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, some
Because
of them
they
just
aren't-
copy information from other places. That's a
they're
really
not-
good point.
They're not necessarily going to be totally accurate.
Adaptive Seeds, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, Southern Exposure down here, Fedco, if you're up in the Northeast, Native Seed Search, if you're in the Southwest. But yeah, kind of like getting a picture of, and the extension service is going to be really good. And just talking to growers is going to be the best. I just want to mention, some folks have shared their email in the chat, because not everybody who's on this call is necessarily a part of any of our online classes, or I will look through the chat and add those emails. But if you were on the call and you want a copy of the recording, just go ahead and sign up for our newsletter at wildabundance.net, and I'll send out the link to the recording to the whole newsletter, just like, hey, we did this, garden consult, and if you want to check it out. So that would be the best way to be sure that you're going to get access to the recording, is just sign up. And if you already are part of any of our online classes, free classes, if we've already emailed you for any reason, then we have that already, but just.
And the
adding that.
newsletter is really cool because each month you get like a list of got to do's, we call them. And so in our newsletter, we list what we're planting each month, which is a pretty awesome thing.
Or harvesting or trellising or,
or canning or harvesting from the wild.
Yeah.
And I just want to put in a plug for the online gardening school, which we are enrolling currently. And it is just like, we put hundreds of hours and so much love into this program. Like, it's really badass and awesome. And so if anyone wants to enroll in it, I think you're making a good choice.
Yeah. And you have access to me all the time because you can ask questions. There's like little in the online classroom, you can type your questions below any of the lessons, and I am the one who gets those and responds to them. So you can be as deeply engaged or not as you want. It's a lot of pre-recorded material, how-tos, visual, hands-on, really detailed. And then also you have space to ask questions. So, and
as well as like, cauliflower for April, there's also just the April overview, each month. So we have like each month there's an overview for each month, plus all of the vegetables. And then there's all of these basics classes too, and some more advanced classes about composting or how to make a raised bed or how to start a garden from grass or starting seeds in pots. Like, it's basically a huge library. Yeah. It's not something that like I'm involved in an online class right now where I'm like, I should be doing like 12 hours, 15 hours a week on this online class, and everyone else is caught up and I'm not caught up. And it's not like that. It's a library that you access as you need it, which is our speed. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Kat. I really wish you well. I hope that you have a great garden year, and just have fun with it, and remember that it's a learning process, and I hope you have good harvest, but also enjoy it.
Yeah. And, something that's really important too is like, it's an experiment, and like, we've been gardening for like 20 years, and every year we learn stuff, and like,
and make mistakes.
So it's funny. I have these garden apprentices right now, it's lovely. They come each week and we garden together. And like, I just recently, got a greenhouse for the first time, which is amazing. And I fried the electricity went out to the greenhouse and the fans didn't open and whatever. I fried a bunch of my starts, and I was like, oh yeah, this happened. And they're like, you sound so casual about it. like, and that's the thing. After you've gardened for a long time, like, it's like when you screw something up, it's just like, that's part of it. And some of it has to do with you learning lessons, and some of it's just like freakish things. Like, there was a rabbit that came and ate all of my spring carrots or sweet potatoes or whatever. And it's like, so there's learning, and there's also just like, I think it's really good, like, mindfulness practice for just letting go. If like something doesn't work, like if you plant 10 crops, hopefully 5 of them will turn out great. And if your other 5 don't, oh, well, you're learning. And that's really the attitude we both really like to take with gardening.
And our world is changing.
Yeah.
Like, that is a reality.
Yeah.
The climate is changing, and the reality of growing food everywhere is changing.
We see it in our gardens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so adapting to that, I just love the seed company Adaptive Seeds, but that's like part of their trip is like, we need seeds that in themselves are resilient, because we need agricultural systems, food systems that have increased resiliency in the face of all that's going on in the world. So gardening as like this point of contact with the bigger world is something that both of us really experience. And there's some things out of our control, like a hard frost in late May in this region, it's like, what can you do about that? Nothing, but planting lots of things, adapting, taking notes in your garden is another awesome thing to do, so that next year, like, oh, when did I do that? Oh, what was that like? What variety was that?
And hedging your bets.
Yeah.
So like, if you're like, I'm counting on, I've started my tomato plants, they're going to be big enough to put them out by this time of year, put out half of them, or maybe you will then have to buy some starts, or maybe not. And maybe that means you get tomatoes in early July because you gambled and you won.
Yeah.
But sometimes you gamble
Yeah.
and you lose.
Creativity,
Yeah.
letting go of attachment, mindfulness, play, beauty. Yes.
Good stuff.
Delicious food. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.